Okay, so today is the first of many videos discussing the highly controversial and contentious Menendez case. Now, what makes me qualified to discuss this? Well, I watched the entirety of the first trial. That is over 200 hours of footage, and I took over 400 pages of my own personal notes while watching the trial. I have read Robert Rand's book, Leslie Abramson's book, Hazel Thornton's book, a bunch of Norman Novelli's. I pretty much intend to read anything and everything that's ever been published on the topic. I have listened to multiple podcasts. I have watched multiple documentaries. Separate and aside from all of that, I have done a great deal of my own independent research. At this point, I have spent over 300 hours looking into this case. But I also have personal knowledge and experience with childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional/psychological abuse. I have over a decade of intensive therapy under my belt, and I have a minor in psychology. So, with my first-hand knowledge of childhood abuse and my second-hand knowledge of this case, I want to lay out for people the evidence which supports and corroborates the claims of abuse. Now, there are four main types of abuse that are commonly accepted. That is physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological/emotional abuse, and neglect. While there is copious amounts of evidence to support each and every one of those categories in this case, right now I'll be focusing particularly on the allegations of sexual abuse. It's important to note that in cases of sexual abuse, you very rarely find substantial evidence or proof, because it's a crime specifically engineered to be kept secret. You're not likely to find eyewitness testimony or video footage of an assault taking place. You're actually not even likely to find a lot of physical evidence from an examination of the body unless it's done immediately after an assault takes place. And as experts testified to in this trial, in the case of sodomy in particular, it is highly unlikely that you will find evidence of sexual abuse due to the durability and adaptability of the anus as an organ. So, the absence of evidence does not mean that no sexual abuse took place. It just so happens that this case actually has a lot more evidence of this abuse than you would see in a lot of average sexual abuse trials. But I find the general protest of "there's no proof," especially when discussing the sexual abuse allegations in this case, particularly fascinating, because there is quite literally, factually, irrefutable evidence that is, number one, public knowledge, and number two, has been confirmed and corroborated by multiple people both inside and outside the family, and that's the fact that Jose Menendez was known to take showers with both of his sons up until their teenage years. This is not speculation or allegation. This is a known fact. This alone is proof of that claim. Showering with your children past the appropriate age is a sexually abusive pattern and behavior. In fact, this claim alone would likely be enough to start an entire CPS investigation. And I know this because a very similar claim is what initiated at least one of the CPS investigations that took place in my childhood. This is wildly inappropriate, highly damaging, and absolutely unacceptable behavior. This is actually a subcategory of sexual abuse, which is much more covert, and it usually manifests itself in health and hygiene. So, showering, washing, grooming, inspecting for potential medical ailments, anything where the adult is asking the child to expose themselves to them or exposing themselves unnecessarily to the child. This is such an insidious behavior, and people don't really understand this, but it robs children of their bodily autonomy, their sense of independence as their own entity and human being that exists separately from their parents, and it completely warps and corrupts their concept of what is and is not appropriate and boundaries. So even if Jose Menendez never did a single other thing to his sons in the way of sexual abuse, this alone is proof of a predatory and sexually abusive tendency and behavior. However, this is only the first piece of evidence. In moving to the second piece of evidence, another familiar chorus we hear in this is, why didn't they tell people? And while that is a deeply flawed line of questioning to begin with, it just so happens that both Erik and Lyle actually did tell people. In 1976, when Lyle was about 8 years old, he told his cousin Diane Vandermolen, who was staying with them at the time, that he and his father were touching each other down there, gesturing to his genitals. I believe he even made an advance on her and actually said that he wanted to touch her genitals. Now, this was obviously very disturbing to her as she was a bit older, and she immediately took it to Kitty and relayed this information to her. Now, Kitty's response was hostility, was denial, was completely ignoring this. She did absolutely nothing. In fact, Kitty actually just dragged him back up to the scene of the crime. he had left his room in the first place because he was afraid an assault was going to take place that night. So she hears this information and does absolutely nothing to investigate, to probe, and completely dismisses this, and then never speaks of it again. Her reaction is so extreme that Diane thought that she must have been mistaken, because it was such a bizarre and odd reaction to ignore this from Kitty that she thought, well, I must be in the wrong. I must have misheard or misunderstood. Unfortunately, it wasn't until after the murders that she realized she was not mistaken. The second person that Lyle told was his then best friend, Donovan Goudreau. 4 months prior to the murder at a Chinese restaurant, Donovan confessed that in childhood he had been sexually molested. Lyle, very obviously moved by this and emotional about this, confessed that both he and Erik had also been sexually molested. What's interesting about this is that when Donovan testified about this at the trial, he denied this conversation having taken place, which is very odd given that he had already relayed this conversation to multiple people. One of the people he had relayed this information to was journalist Robert Rand, who had a recorded discussion of them talking about this conversation where Lyle confessed his molestation to Donovan. As for Erik, when Erik was about 12 years old and his cousin Andy Cano was about 10 years old, he asked whether or not it was normal for fathers and sons to give each other massages. He said that his father had been, quote, massaging his dick, obviously an apt use of language by a 12-year-old. Andy was very confused by this and really didn't know how to answer, given that he really didn't have that kind of relationship with his father at all. So he suggested they go ask his mother to see if it's normal or not, at which point Erik freaked out, panicked, and begged him to keep this a secret. And upon a sacred pinky promise, he did. There were a few subsequent discussions about this subject matter between the two of them, in which Erik had revealed that the massages were beginning to hurt. And also, Andy inquired about why he hadn't told his mom, and Erik said that he didn't want his mom to be mad at his dad, essentially. In a newly discovered piece of information, there was a letter that Erik sent to Andy where he discusses that the abuse was still taking place. This is about a 3-page letter, so I will read the excerpt directly that pertains to this. I've been trying to avoid Dad. It's still happening, Andy, but it's worse for me now. I can't explain it. He's so overweight that I can't stand to see him. I never know when it's going to happen, and it's driving me crazy. Every night I stay up thinking he might come in. The next piece of evidence is the naked photos. When Erik was around 6 and Lyle was around 8, there were pictures that were taken of them and then subsequently kept and cataloged by their mother. This was evidenced by the envelope where the photos were developed, having Kitty's handwriting on it, labeling it Erik's 6th birthday. Now, these photos are interspersed in and around photos from Erik's actual 6th birthday, but this confirms that Kitty had knowledge of it and decided to keep these pictures. So not only were they taken in the first place, but then they were actually kept. Despite what people might try and argue, these are not typical photos. They're not doing anything. The entire purpose and focus of these photos is these children's naked bodies. In fact, their head is actually cut off. You literally cannot see their head. It is just their body, and focus specifically on, in one case, erect genitalia of these children. I quite literally cannot show you the uncensored photos because then this video would be flagged as child pornography. The next piece of evidence is the throat injury. There are medical records to corroborate a visit to the ER that took place when Erik was about 7 years old, citing an unexplained throat injury. This was an injury to the posterior pharynx, the uvula, and the soft palate. That's the very back of the throat. And this is a common phenomenon in abusive households and families. Number one, the parent is reluctant to even take their child to get medical attention when they have an injury that was caused by abuse. And number two, if and when they do take their child to get medical attention and care, they will often cite it as unexplained. They will give no further elucidation, no further explanation, and that is very suspicious. I have personal knowledge of this happening. This happened a lot in my life, and this is a classic behavior of abusive parents. Now, I want to make it very clear, while not determinative, there are other things that could have caused this injury. It is consistent with forcible oral copulation. This is actually something that dentists are trained to look for in identifying and reporting child abuse. The next piece of evidence is the Rosello and Menudo allegation. In the 2023 documentary Menendez plus Menudo, Boys Betrayed, Rosello, a former member of the boy band Menudo, alleges that Jose sexually abused him. Menudo was a Puerto Rican boy band, and they would essentially cycle out their members every time that one of them hit puberty or started to look too old. How that didn't raise any eyebrows, I have absolutely no idea, but the founder, Edgardo Diaz, has been facing consistent allegations of pedophilia and sexual abuse since 1991. When Jose was an executive at RCA Records, he was essentially in charge of the boy band Menudo, and Roy Rosello alleges that in a trip to his New Jersey home at age 14, Jose Menendez drugged and subsequently raped him. The next piece of evidence which supports these allegations is the known and established rule that nobody could even enter the hallway down which Jose, behind closed doors, was quote-unquote punishing either Lyle or Erik. Cousins Alan Anderson and Kathleen Simonton both testified to the fact that there was a big deal made out of not even going in the direction of those rooms, despite the fact that they were already locked and already behind closed doors. In fact, Alan Anderson said that when he would hear cries from the boys and then yelling from Jose, Kitty would actually just turn up the volume on the television set to drown out the noise. It's unclear whether or not this was accompanied by or in conjunction with the physical abuse that took place. He was known to beat them with belts and would often take them for punishment. It's unknown whether or not this is kind of a part of that, but the alliance formed between the parents and the overall secrecy here is highly suspect. The next piece of evidence comes from Kitty's therapy notes. So in Dr. Summerfield, Kitty's therapist, notes, she references, quote, sick and embarrassing secrets within her family. The sexually advanced behavior from Lyle. This is a hallmark sign of childhood sexual abuse that many doctors, medical professionals, therapists, teachers are trained to look out for. If they display knowledge or behavior that exceeds their proper age limit as far as sexuality goes, then that is highly suspect and that should be a red flag. There are 3 separate reports of this behavior from Lyle, all of which take place within the family. So this is, again, indicative of a modeled and learned incestuous behavior. Their cousin, Diane Vandermolen, talks about 2 incidents, the first of which took place in the basement where the boys and her were kind of just playing, play wrestling, and all of a sudden it really quickly escalated to them tying her up and stripping her down to her bra. The second incident took place when Lyle was about 14 years old, and they were just sitting on the couch watching TV, nothing out of the ordinary, when Lyle all of a sudden crawled on top of her, mounted her, and fondled her breasts. In the trial, multiple expert witnesses testified to this kind of behavior. Dr. John Briere cited multiple studies to explain how pervasive of a symptom of childhood sexual abuse this is. Notably, despite never having interviewed Erik or Lyle or even knowing anything about the case whatsoever, when asked for an example about this behavior, he said, and I quote, mounting other children, which I found to be very interesting. Dr. John Conti, when asked about the significance of this testimony from Diane, said that this was corroborative of Lyle's claims of sexual abuse with his mother. At this point, Lyle had had no independent experiences with sexuality whatsoever. So this modeled behavior, particularly of a heterosexual nature toward a woman, is learned from somewhere and then exhibited later, and that aligns with what Lyle said happened between him and Kitty. He also points out that Diane's sense that he knew what he was doing or was experienced is an extremely common phenomenon and a really good indicator that something suspect is happening. There is another instance of this that doesn't have independent corroboration, which for the most part, these pieces of evidence that I'm listing do have independent corroboration because I know people have a credibility issue with the brothers, but both Lyle and Erik testified to the fact that after being sexually abused by Jose, Lyle then exhibited the exact same behaviors on to Erik. He would, quote, play with him in the way that Jose played with him. The next piece of evidence is the fact that Erik and Lyle both exhibited behaviors and symptoms of sexually abused children in droves. Many child abuse experts testified to these symptoms in the trial itself, but this is also done in conjunction now with the larger body of research and literature that has been done about the symptoms and potential indicators that a child is being sexually abused. Firstly, I'll go through the symptoms that both of them share, and then I'll go to the ones that are specific and individual to each of them. The first is frequent stomach issues. So this is unexplained pain or aches. This is gastrointestinal issues. This is abdominal injury, perhaps. Both their aunts, Terry and Marta, testified to knowing about these issues, these being recurring issues, taking Erik to the pediatrician because the pain was so severe, them losing weight. This happened both before and after the murders. They both have medical records which corroborate frequent visits to physicians about unexplained stomach aches or pains, and in Lyle's case, a removal of a hernia when he was younger. Another symptom that both of them share is stuttering or speech articulation issues. I believe both of them wound up with a speech articulation disorder diagnosis officially, but multiple cousins testified about seeing this, about witnessing Kitty and Jose actually taunt them and terrorize them about this. The next symptom that they share has by far the most witnesses. It is unbelievable how many people testified to both of them having concentration issues or issues with disassociation. For example, I'll list some of them. Kathleen Simonton and Diane Vandermolen cousins, Alicia Hers, family friend, Patricia Cross, who's a teacher, Barbara Hayworth, who's a teacher, Norman Poles, who's a tutor, Douglas Doss, who's a tennis coach, Janet Stolzfud, a teacher, Sandra Sharp, who's a teacher, Charles Waddlington, who's a coach, Barbara Zussman, who's a teacher. I mean, the amount of people that testified to this is really, really remarkable. And not only the volume of people that testified, but also the things that they would say were very interesting to me, particularly given how little was known about disassociation at that time. The descriptions of these incidents, of them spacing out, staring into space, going elsewhere in their mind. They weren't there. This is a coping mechanism which is made by a lot of sexual abuse survivors, not even just in childhood, but in adulthood. An adult woman being raped will often employ this as a coping mechanism as well. So the fact that so many people notice this and were able to describe it in such detail is really, really remarkable and significant. It's also relevant to note that learning disorders can actually be exacerbated by trauma, by CPTSD, things like that. So in the diagnosis of Erik, he has dysnomia, dysgraphia, dyslexia, and auditory processing disorder, speech articulation disorder, as well as ADD/ADHD. And the overlap of CPTSD, childhood trauma, and ADHD/ADD, neurodivergence in general, is vast, and I too am one of those members. Other symptoms that were specific to Erik: sleepwalking, recurring nightmares. He talked to multiple people about this. This was pretty well known and documented. Anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. Most anyone who has ever met him testified to the fact that he was unusually emotional, and that really stood out to them. He was often very sad. He would cry a lot. That's how he would express himself. Almost anyone who met him talked about him having anxiety and depression. But also, the suicidal ideation is well documented from many doctors. I believe he even was on suicide watch within the prison. I believe prison staff reported to Dr. Vickery that they were concerned about Erik. So his tendency to fantasize about suicide, to dream of suicide, that was the whole thing that got him to the confession with Dr. Rosello in the first place, is that he was contemplating suicide. His auditory processing disorder is another one that's pretty distinct to him. Again, hearing his teachers talk about the specific issues that he had, and hearing it over and over and over again, that all of these teachers noticed the exact same thing and wrote this down in their notes over years and years. He also, I believe, went to get tested for this, or he went to a school for this. He definitely did for different learning disabilities, although that was never really followed up on. So again, there are records to corroborate this as well, but it's interesting because you can see evidence of this firsthand if you watch his testimony. He really does have this issue. He has problems and trouble understanding what is being said. He kind of interprets it a little bit differently. He will answer a question that really wasn't asked. You'll have to redirect. You can tell that he didn't understand the question or he didn't properly hear it. It's very interesting to see such blatant proof of this in him. He also reported auditory hallucinations to Dr. Vickery. Once he was incarcerated, he would hear his father's voice in his cell. And what Dr. Vickery said about this was very interesting to me, because he said he basically has a method from which to determine if this is the truth or a lie. And he asks patients where they are hearing the sound from. And usually if they would answer, in my head, that would be an indication that maybe they are lying, maybe this is fabricated. But the ones who answered differently were telling the truth. And Erik answered, when asked that question, that his dad was in the cell. It sounded like his dad was right next to him, in his ear, in the cell. instead of saying that it was inside his head. So that was another thing that gave Dr. Vickery confidence that this was credible testimony. For symptoms particular to Lyle, bedwetting and premature hair loss, he began losing his hair when he was about 14, and it was acute enough that preemptively before Princeton, he was wearing a hairpiece by age 19. He was known to wet the bed. This was something that was known, and he was very ashamed. He did this into his teenage years. These are pretty specific symptoms of abuse. I read a little bit more about hair loss, and there are more recent studies which link PTSD and hair loss and the potential indicators that something volatile is going on emotionally. It's very interesting. This is a growing body of research recently. I recommend that anybody read The Body Keeps the Score and or The Deepest Well if they want to learn more about the phenomenon of a lot of physical symptoms and conditions manifesting exclusively as a consequence of abuse and trauma. It is remarkable the amount of physical effect and repercussions that an emotional experience can have on you. He also had issues with teeth grinding. This is usually stress. They both had headaches as well, but Lyle in particular had a regression behavior, so regression to childlike behavior in playing with stuffed animals. This is one of the most commented on things in the trial, actually. Lyle's obsession, preoccupation, relationship, dependence on stuffed animals into his late teenage years. Everyone knew about this. Of course, his entire family. They had pictures of his hoard of stuffed animals, which enveloped the bed so much so that he really didn't even have any room to sleep. There was a card that he wrote to a high school sweetheart from Lyle, and then he listed out the names of all of his stuffed animals. He gave a family of stuffed animals to his girlfriend because he felt like that was his real family. He actually got in trouble once for bringing his stuffed animals to class and raising their hands instead of his own. And actually, Dr. John Conti talked about this being one of the factors that really convinced him that this was credible testimony. The fact is that this is a very common symptom in child abuse victims, but at that time, at least, it was not written about. So this is not the kind of thing that you can just read a book about child abuse and then adopt into your defense. This is something that you would have to experience firsthand in order to know about. But he talks about how they were kind of arbiters of justice. They would have kind of mock trials and courtrooms to debate what was going on, whether what dad or mom was doing was okay, and they had judges that were impartial, and they had some nasty characters and some good ones. It is really, really in-depth. But again, a reliance upon or dependence on stuffed animals into your teenage years and late teenage years is indicative that something is going on that really needs to be looked at. The next piece of evidence is expert testimony. It is unbelievable how qualified they are, how much experience they have, and the truth is that all of them believe the allegations of abuse and have determined them to be credible. It is in fact their job, actually, to interview so many people and determine whether or not an allegation is credible. There are methods and modems to actually discover this, which all of them employed, and they all came away with the same impression that this was absolutely 100% authentic. Just to give you an example of how qualified these experts are, Dr. Ann Burgess, recognized nationwide as an expert in child sexual abuse. She coined the term rape trauma syndrome in one of her studies that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. She was contacted by the FBI as an expert in victimology and helped develop psychological profiles of perpetrators, as well as a categorization of different homicides based on what you can observe at the crime scene. She actually, I didn't know this, fun fact, if anybody has seen Mindhunter, the character Wendy Carr is based off of her and the work she has done with the FBI. Dr. John Conti, professor of social work, editor of the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, had over 42 peer-reviewed articles published in areas of childhood sexual abuse, professional practices validating allegations of abuse, very interesting, abuse effects, and society's difficulty in believing abuse allegations. How apt. He was charged by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services with reviewing existing research on child abuse and developing a research agenda for the next decade of research. Do you know how qualified you have to be to have the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services enlist you to make a framework for the next decade of research on child abuse? He agreed that this was a severe case of abuse and even went so far as to say that he maybe thought that Lyle was actually concealing more abuse from him. He was not sure that that was the extent of the sexual abuse in particular with the father that took place. He had a suspicion that perhaps there was more that Lyle was concealing. For Dr. Ann Tyler, she was an expert in the area of identification and evaluation of child abuse. She taught courses and seminars about this abuse to police officers and CPS workers. She was asked to offer blind analysis of this case as a member of the Psychological Maltreatment Consortium, which was comprised of national leading experts in the field of child development, child abuse, and child maltreatment. After 30 hours of interviews with Erik and reviewing all the available material, in her determination, she found psychological maltreatment in every single category. And not only that, she offered a lot of examples for each individual category of psychological maltreatment, as well as the developmental ages and stages that correspond with each of those. She also rejected the notion that this could be a fabrication because he had so many of the qualities of the abusive family, as well as so much independent corroboration. Dr. William Vickery ran a sex offender treatment program at USC Medical School for 5 years, probably meaning that he did more evaluations of persons accused of sex crimes than any of the doctors in Los Angeles County. He had had experience with over 750 homicides at that point. He had some experience with parricide in particular, and he worked with Erik for 6 years. Dr. Stuart Hart, he chaired the international task force that developed the Declaration for Psychological Rights of the Child and brought that back to the United States. He did a lot of international work. That was what I was noticing when I was going down his qualifications. He interviewed Lyle for 60 hours and came to the conclusion that this was a severe case of maltreatment. And he even went as far as to say that if he excluded everything he learned from the interviews, he would still come to the same determination with everything else, with the medical records, with the witnesses, with the corroboration, the knowledge that he knew independently from that testimony. He would still come to the same determination that this was severe psychological maltreatment. The next piece of evidence is Lyle's essay. This is one thing that is commonly seen in children processing childhood sexual abuse. You will often see them write about it or make art containing usually disturbing or frightening themes of sexual abuse or sexuality in general. And Lyle, when he was 14 years old, wrote an essay called "I Will Change Your Verdict" for school. This was a story about a father who was a former serial child rapist and murderer who was on death row for killing someone who molested his own child. I can't even begin to unpack all of that. And if I thought that this was compelling information when I first heard about the existence of this, that was only furthered when I actually read it. The story takes an unexpected turn when he essentially starts advocating for the father's life. And he says, well, what about his wife and his sons? What are his wife and sons going to do without him if he's put to death? He changed. He was reformed. And actually, he didn't do anything wrong in killing this one guy because he was protecting his son. So to me, I hear all sorts of things there, but I'm like, okay, we have a rescue fantasy. We have him wishing that his father was different, could be reformed, could stop this behavior, feeling like he wanted protection from this type of behavior. Also contemplating what would happen if he were to confess about this. If he were to go to the police with this information, what would that look like? What would that do to their family? Like, the thoughts and the contemplations here have such severe implications, at least in my opinion, and I think it is very notable. I would recommend reading this if you have not. The next piece of evidence is Kitty and Jose's obsession with Lyle's girlfriends. Multiple family members, family friends, personal friends of Kitty's, even her therapist testified to the very bizarre preoccupation that both her and Jose had with their sons' romantic and sexual lives, particularly with Lyle. Kitty and Jose were consistently disapproving of pretty much anyone that Lyle had interest in, calling them gold diggers, bimbos, and sluts, even worrying about them bringing AIDS into the house. They forced Lyle to break up with many of his girlfriends. They enlisted someone to spy on and surveil Lyle while he was at college to see if his girlfriend was sleeping over at his apartment. Kitty gave Erik a 6-month deadline to get a girlfriend, and they even specifically chose someone for Lyle to date and enforce that relationship. And it is not, as the defense keenly pointed out, insignificant that when putting these two pictures next to each other of this woman that Kitty and Jose chose for Lyle to date and essentially marry, actually, and next to Kitty, a young Kitty, there is a significant resemblance. And not only a physical resemblance, but the fact that both of them are beauty queens. This is the person that they chose for him to be with. A carbon copy of his mother. Just think about that. Just think about the implications, you know what I mean? Dr. Edwin Cox, Kitty's therapist, remarked on the fact that Kitty was particularly aggrieved that one of these girlfriends was taking Lyle places sexually he wasn't ready for. One of Lyle's girlfriends actually went and testified to an experience in which Kitty basically interrogated her and hounded her about whether or not her and Lyle were sexually active. She was very dominating, very forceful. She pushed her back down into her seat. She made her feel terrible. This girl literally cries recounting this experience, and she said her self-worth and self-esteem has been so damaged by that. And as if that interference was not enough, Jose had two particular instances, one of which was with Jamie Pizarczyk, one of Lyle's kind of longtime girlfriends, where he paid for her to get a sponsorship so that she would be playing abroad and be geographically separated from Lyle. And one of Lyle's other girlfriends became pregnant, and Jose essentially paid her off, paid her to get an abortion against Lyle's knowledge and desires and will. He was ready to marry her and raise this child, and behind his back, Jose paid this girl to get an abortion. The next piece of evidence is the massages in public. Jose was known and seen to massage the bodies of his young boys before and after sports practices in plain view of everybody else, which normalizes this behavior. And this is a common pattern with grooming and escalation in particular. You normalize behavior, you do it in plain view of everybody so that there is a justification. It doesn't seem out of the ordinary to exploit the trust of the child, and then when behind closed doors, you start to escalate. Dr. Ann Burgess refers to this as the access and entrapment phase. She describes this phenomenon really succinctly, but she also discusses the kind of mythology, the justification that surrounds this, that is interesting and seen throughout many different iterations of the family and dynamics and environments, where basically at this point, Jose would say, you know, these massages, it needed to relieve tension. You know, because they were sports players, they needed to have these massages all the time, things like that. And you start to have a justification and a reasoning for why this thing is being done. Now, a similar thing took place with other sexual abuse. Now, Diane Vandermolen testified to the fact that after their group showers, they would all get in their little robes and go sit down for a history lesson by Jose. She saw this happening. This was a common occurrence. This was a ritualistic practice for them, in fact. And this corresponds with the testimony of both Erik and Lyle that basically their dad at the beginning would frame it as a history lesson and would talk to them about the ancient Greek and Roman soldiers having sex before battle as a way to justify and explain what was happening here. We see a lot of this type of behavior in this family. The next piece of evidence is the pornographic media that the children were exposed to by Kitty and Jose. Alicia Hers, who was cited as a friend of Kitty and Jose, also a teacher, was invited over with a bunch of the neighborhood, and at some point Jose put on a sexually explicit and what she described as pornographic film in plain view of everybody. He apparently thought this was funny or amusing or appropriate somehow. But she also discussed that she felt that Kitty and Jose had a, quote, corrupting influence on the boys by exposing them or allowing them to be exposed to this media that was far too explicit and mature for their ages. The film that she cited was Pixote that he put on. Now, this is not pornography. It is actually a critically acclaimed film. But I wanted to know what I was up against. So I watched a good deal of it. And about 7 minutes in, there is a brutal, I believe, gang rape of a little boy in an orphanage. And it follows suit the entire time. It is assaults, it is rapes, it is sex trafficking, it is naked boys in the shower. There's one shot where they're all of the boys from the orphanage, and they're little, and these were like young kids too. I don't know what the laws were about this, but surely, I'm like, these kids could not have been doing this on camera because they were actual, literal children. Hopefully some laws are in place about that now, but yeah, there's a scene with all of them in the shower, all these little boys from the orphanage, and they're all completely naked. There's a lot of like homophobic and like gay interactions and sex trafficking and prostitution. Like, it is unbelievable. Like, in fact, let me read you the little warnings. Okay. Themes of child abuse, degradation, violence, prostitution, torture, and disturbing subject matter. Depictions of sexual violence, nudity, and violence are shown in this film. And this was just a fun little flick he put on to entertain the masses. And I find the violence and torture aspect of it in particular very interesting because it is consistent with his sadistic personality, both inside and outside of the allegations of abuse. The next piece of evidence is generational trauma. So sisters of both Kitty and Jose have now talked about how abusive their environments growing up were. His sister Marta Cano discussed the fact that when she was 5 and Jose was about 3, she would walk in and witness her mother fondling the baby until he became erect, at which point she would kind of point and laugh and say, "Ha, look at how cute, look how funny that is." And this was a common practice for her. She actually suspected that the abuse went on much longer than this. And there's, interestingly enough, a note from the second trial that Erik said that he basically, there was an evil side to his grandmother, and Jose learned from her, which makes sense. As for Kitty, Kitty herself in therapy described the fact that her father was abusive and said that she essentially married her father in Jose. But recently, just about a month ago, Joan Vandermolen, Kitty's sister, made a very disturbing comment in an article when asked about this and said that their dad, quote, tried to get fresh with both of them. Joan was of the opinion that Kitty was sexually assaulted when she was, I believe, in boarding school. Marta was of the opinion that her mother was also molested and then went on to molest. This is a common thing that you see in abuse. It is a cycle. It is a repeating pattern. You will see it go from generation to generation to generation. Someone has to break the cycle in order for that to stop. That's not to say, of course, that if you are abused, you will go on to abuse your children. But again, statistically speaking, if that type of abuse has occurred in your household and in your environment growing up, it validates claims against you if you are accused of having done that. The connection is very clear. Another thing I want to briefly touch on is not explicitly sexual, but just more blurring of boundaries. Cousin Diane Vandermolen testified to the fact that Kitty basically gave her lectures about how she shouldn't have kids because they get in the way of the marriage. They drive a wedge between you and her husband. She frequently expressed that she felt the boys were taking Jose away from her or separating them, and she was very jealous of the attention that Jose gave them. Which, if she knew about the abuse taking place, which by many accounts she did, she made these statements and felt jealousy that he was sexually abusing them and not her, I suppose. It is so sick and convoluted. This also extended to Lyle with his stuffed animals. I mean, the jealousy, the insecurity, the blurred boundaries, so weird. She would punish Lyle through his stuffed animals because she said she felt like he loved the stuffed animals more than her. Diane also testified to the fact that in their teenage years and mid to late teenage years, when Jose was away, Erik and Lyle would fight over who got to sleep in bed with the mom, which again, in and of itself is not necessarily incriminating, but given Lyle's testimony, certainly seems odd. And it appeared odd at the time to Diane as well, who also says she witnessed Kitty taking Lyle to help him wash his hair at age 14, and they would disappear. And again, as Lyle testified, he said that this would happen, that sexual abuse, molestation would occur through the guise of assisting with bathing, which again, is a very common phenomenon. I am personally familiar with this. The next piece of evidence is the now infamous 17-page letter that Lyle wrote to Erik while they were incarcerated. He signed the letter, "Please destroy L," and Erik did not destroy it, which is why it got confiscated later by prison staff. But in it, he says, and I quote, "We alone know the truth. We alone know the secret of our family's past." So again, all these allusions to secrets and sick secrets and keeping secrets and being secretive, this is highly unusual and highly suspect. Something is deeply, dysfunctional at the very least. The last thing I want to discuss a little bit, I have stayed away mostly from things that Lyle and Erik have said and have gone to things that multiple other people have confirmed, because I know people have an issue with witness credibility in Lyle and Erik's cases. But I do want to say that some of the testimony that they gave was then later details were corroborated by other factors and by other people. So one of them is the lemon. Erik testified to the fact that he would put a bunch of cinnamon in his dad's drinks and drench his own food in lemon to mitigate the taste of semen. And he said that there was a constant stock of lemons. He was always drenching his food in lemons. His mom made sure that that was always fully stocked. And relatively recently, Joan Vandermolen and Diane Vandermolen talked about an incident in which he freaked out when he didn't have his lemon. And they also cited ketchup, which Erik himself had never mentioned. But the use of lemon is certainly corroborated. At the time, they didn't understand, but in the context of what Erik has said, obviously this is a detail that can be corroborated. Another detail from Erik's testimony is the use of Vaseline. This was in both Erik and Lyle's testimony. Their dad's usage of Vaseline, that basically he would always place it in the same place, like in Erik's room, and it was to stay there and not be touched, and it would go from house to house with them, and it was for that explicit purpose. It was very clear that this Vaseline was for this purpose. And there was one time where Andy said that he got a cut and attempted to use the Vaseline that was in Erik's room, and Erik freaked out and told him that it wasn't for that, that wasn't that purpose, he couldn't touch it, he shouldn't touch it. And again, if you cross-reference that to the testimony, that aligns. There's also a picture of Erik's bedroom that they took at the time of the crime, and the location of the Vaseline is corroborated by this picture. Now, whether or not that was used for sexual abuse is more debatable. There are more options there, but I just do want to say that there's a lot of their testimony that is corroborated by so many other people. Not just the sexual testimony, but I mean pretty much everything that they say, except for the incidents of sexual abuse, because that would only be taking place behind closed doors with two people in the room, of course. Everything else that they claim or they say is consistent with everything everyone else says. And these are some examples. I know that there are a lot of arguments against this evidence, and it's important to note that this is circumstantial evidence, but it has to be circumstantial evidence. There really is no other kind of evidence, and actually there is some tangible evidence, like the pictures, although people could debate the source and the reason for those pictures. And again, I have responses to each and every refutation or rebuttal to these pieces of evidence that I laid out. I don't know that I have the time to get into all of them right now, but I just want to lay out all the evidence that does corroborate these claims of abuse, because people often say, oh, there's no proof, there's no evidence. And I don't know what people are expecting. I don't know if they're expecting to see video footage of an assault taking place. That's not very realistic. But all of this is corroborating evidence. Absolutely. And particularly this video, I focused on the sexual abuse allegations. I will absolutely delve into the other types of abuse later. I have much more where this came from. This is an endlessly fascinating case. There is so much to talk about. I'm extremely passionate about it, and you can expect to see much more from me on this topic. So I will see you soon.